I can't believe this. So you're going to tell me that this man did not resist arrest and he didn't reach for a gun? We're going to see. Remember, they were responding to a 911 call where a 250-pound black man who was outside selling CDs was brandishing a weapon, and they're responding to the call that he pointed the gun at somebody. Resisting. Now, he may be saying, "What did I do? What did I do?" But he's resisting. He's not following their instructions. They back up, they tase him. He's saying, "I didn't do anything." Mind you, hold on, let me back up some. Mind you, the whole time, they believe that he has a gun on him the whole time. You have to keep that in mind. That's the whole point of them being there. So they're treating him like somebody who has a gun on him. They tased him twice. Didn't work. So this cop is going to try to tackle him. He slams them all over the cars. He slams them to the ground. Boom. They're trying to arrest him. He's resisting. He's resisting. Now you may say he's resisting because he's scared, or he's resisting because he got attacked. Whatever you may say, he's resisting. So the struggle ensues. He puts the gun on his chest. You tell me, I'm gonna back it up a little bit. Once that cop pulls his gun out and puts it on his chest, you look and you see if that guy moves or not. Gun's on his chest. What did he do? He tried to get up. We're going to back it up again. He tried to get up. And that's the time when they said he's going for the gun. Watch his head come up and everything. Oh, but he didn't do anything. Now watch him go for the gun. Oh, where's his hand? Wait. Where's his hand at? So after he gets shot and he turns around, what does he do? Watch his right hand. Watch his right hand. Oh, wait, where's his hand at? Oops, I went back too far. I'm going to show you the very exact point where he reaches for that gun. All right, so nope. Look, where's his hand? Where's his hand at? Where's his right hand at? His right hand is going for the gun. So, of course, this was after he was shot the first time. But as you can see, when he was on the ground, when they had him on the ground, he went for the gun. Why do you think they backed up? They shot him and backed up. And then he went for the gun again. This is a joke. This is a joke. All he had to do... Now, what's that? What's that? It's a gun. He had a gun. And at the very least, the second time, you can see he went for it. Now, you may say, oh, well, he got shot, so he went for his gun. He's a convicted felon. He's not supposed to have a gun. The police are there because he was waving a gun at somebody. And you're going to defend this as police brutality? This is a joke. This is a joke. This guy, all he had to do was comply. All he had to do was comply. So again, that whole crazy tackle and all of that, it goes back to they told him. They warned him. They tased him. They're not going to keep asking you, especially if they think that you're an armed person. If you don't comply when they ask you, they're going to tell you. If you don't comply when they tell you, they're going to force you. And that's what that whole crazy tackle was about. Now they're on the ground and he's still resisting. He's still resisting. If he wasn't resisting, they would have just cuffed him. And you can see him. He's going to try to get up and go for the gun. Watch. So he didn't do nothing. He was complying. He was complying. That's a joke. This is a joke. And sure enough, what they do is they retrieve right where they retrieve the gun. So he tried to get up. He tried to go for the gun at the same time, and they shot him. And after they shot him, he went for it again. I'm gonna look at this one more time. All he had to do was do it. Look, they're trying to arrest him. Let me ask you this: if this was police brutality, if they just wanted to kill him, why didn't they shoot him near? Why go through tackling him to the ground and shooting him when you're right next to your partner? Who's going to shoot their gun right next to their partner? All he had to do was do what they said at this point right here. All he had to do. All he had to do was comply. You're going to see him clear as day try to get up. You're going to see it. Now, again, these officers believe that he is armed, and as it turns out, he is armed. They cannot allow him any kind of leeway or wiggle room because he's armed. So they are doing what they're supposed to do. He pulls the gun on his chest. You tell me if that guy moves or not. Oh, but he didn't move. He didn't do nothing. Whatever. Went for the gun twice. All right, so here is the Attorney General's report on the Alton Sterling incident after they conducted their investigation. And the main thing I want to look at in this video is the use of force experts' analysis of what happened during this case. So this website is thehayride.com. You can see, I'll leave a link for you to check it out. But and this is what I've been telling people. You can't go by how things look by a camera. You can't go by your opinion of what's right or what's wrong. You have to go by what their protocol says. And the use of force experts who investigated this case go step by step through it. And that's what I want to look at. So I'm going to skip some of this. You can, like I said, go back and read it for all the details, but I'm going to skip some of this and go right to the use of force analysis. Before I get to the use of force expert, I want to go over this summary of what happened. This is the Attorney General's summary of what happened, not just an officer or whatever. So on 7/5/2016 at approximately 12:35 a.m., dispatcher Dunder. Let me stop here. The reason why I'm going to go into this is this provides context to what officers are thinking and what they're responding to. That's going to come into play when you look at the use of force analysis. So let me start over. On 7/5/2016 at approximately 12:35 a.m., dispatcher Dunder of the Baton Rouge Police Department received a 911 call from the person later identified as John Young. John Young called 911 to report that a person later identified as Sterling was selling CDs in front of the Triple S Food Mart after midnight. Young advised the dispatcher that Sterling was armed with a handgun and had showed it to Young in a threatening way. And then it talks about the law as, I'm going to skip that part. As it says right here, Young described Sterling as a black man wearing a red shirt, weighing approximately 250 pounds, selling CDs in front of the store after midnight. Young reiterates several times that Sterling has a handgun in his pocket. So several minutes later, Young called 911 again and spoke with dispatcher Jordan. Young began to provide additional information and request a plainclothes officer. However, as he was on the phone with the dispatcher, Young advised the police were at the location with Sterling. Young then hung up the phone. While viewing the security footage from the Triple S store, along with the officer's body cameras and police unit cameras, and the enhanced videos generated by the United States Department of Justice, the following was observed. On July 5th, 2016, at approximately 12:16 a.m., Alton Sterling is seen in front of the Triple S store apparently selling bootlegged CDs. At about this time, he is seen walking to the corner of the store and threatening someone with what was later determined to be a firearm concealed in his pocket, presumably the victim, Mr. Young. Sterling then returns to his position in the front of the store and continues his illicit activities. So this is basically saying that he was seen on tape actually doing the threatening of someone with a gun. That's just a little bit of context. All right, I'm going to skip some of this down here. It gives a step-by-step or play-by-play observation by the investigators. But the reason why I'm going to skip it is because in the use of force section, it goes over pretty much all of the same thing. It is also worth noting that during the autopsy here, of course, he died by gunshot wounds. But these are the things that these are the results of the autopsy blood test of Alton Sterling. He had methamphetamine in the system. He had a little bit of alcohol. He had cocaine in the system. And there's a reason why they include all this in an autopsy, and there's a reason why they include all this in this report. For the obvious reasons, it can affect the person's behavior. So he says, additionally, Sterling's urine tested positive for opioids, cocaine, cannabinoids, amphetamines, and fentanyl. So and this was not something the police officers knew, but just he had threatened someone with a gun, which is, they did know that, and he had all this different stuff in his system. The next part of the report goes over his history with law enforcement, like his arrest record and that sort of thing. I'm going to skip that for now. However, if you were to read this, you'll see a couple of different scenarios where he resisted arrest in a very similar fashion. But that's for you to read. I'm going to skip that, but I just wanted to make a note of that. So the next part of this report, it refers to statements given by various witnesses and both of the police officers. I'm going to skip that. And here you go. This is what I want to get to. The use of force experts. The United States Department of Justice engaged independent, qualified experts in law enforcement use of force, Kenneth Sanders and Charles Key. Both of these experts independently reviewed the investigative materials and disclosed their findings and opinions to the FBI. Both experts concluded that the actions of Officers Lake and Salamoni did not amount to an unreasonable use of force. Both experts agreed that Officer Lake and Salamoni were justified in the use of force. So now, in this here, it's kind of just talking about, I'll read it. Mr. Sanders' ability and skills are well documented, and he is recognized by federal authorities as a documented expert in use of force. To summarize, Mr. Sanders' analysis of the case involving Alton Sterling. Mr. Sanders states that the force used by officers Lake and Salamone was justifiable and reasonable. And this is something important here that you ought to know. And this is something that I've brought up before. What is the barometer? What is the standard? What is the law? And he's going to refer to something of precedence here that's very important. In this interview provided by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Mr. Sanders cited United States Supreme Court's case, Graham versus Connor, and used 4 focal points to establish the reasonableness of force given in a given incident. The 4 points referred to by the acronym SURF are as follows. Now, before I go down and read that again, I always keep saying, you have to go by what the law says, not just what you make up in your mind. And let's take a look at what the standard is. Severity of the crime, immediacy of the threat, resistance of the subject, flight of the subject. Now, the severity of the crime, the guy who was armed, that's going to affect how the police interact with the person. So that's something you take into account with determining how much force you're going to need. Force should be used, is justifiable. Now, what was this crime? The severity of the crime was threatening someone with a gun. The immediacy of the threat. Now, listen to what the guy says about this. It should be noted that some use of force experts combine resistance and flight as a single factor. The presence of any one of the SURF factors justifies the use of some level of force under Graham versus Connor. Now, Graham versus Connor is an old court case where that basically they created the guidelines for this thing here. Mr. Sanders addressed the SURF model as it applies in this investigation as follows. The first 2 factors, severity of the crime and the immediacy of the threat, were met before the officers arrived on the scene and encountered Sterling. The officers were advised Sterling was in possession of a weapon and had brandished it on the complainant. Any reasonable officer, without the benefit of hindsight, would have understood the severity of the crime and felt the immediacy of the threat. So here you go, right here. It's a lot of times, people say like, well, you got to know what happened before the video started. And even I used to say this. A lot of people say like, no, that don't matter. All that matters is the shooting. But according to the law, what happens before that shooting, before the shooting or before the arrest actually does matter according to the law. Upon encountering Sterling, the officers used verbal commands. The use of verbal commands did not work. Sterling immediately resisted. There was a flex in Sterling's chest and his hands came above his waist, which are both signs of aggression. Hands up in the air would have demonstrated compliance. So again, like, you didn't even get to the shooting yet, and this is what I've been saying. Like, demand proof based on training and what experts say. And basically what the experts are saying, and they're, at this point it's talking about when they first confronted him. When they first confronted him, there was flex in his chest and his hand came up above his waist, which are both signs of aggression. Sanders, the expert, did not have a problem with the officers pulling their service weapons out and having them at the ready position. He believed Officer Salamone's pointing his service weapon at Sterling's head and using profane language was a policy issue, and Salamone should have been disciplined, but it was not a Fourth or Eighth Amendment issue. I'm not really, to be honest, I don't know what those amendments are off the top of my head. But this is why the guy got fired, because he pointed the gun at his head and said, "I'm gonna blow your effing head off." That's the policy issue. That does not mean like that, people are saying, well, he got fired, so therefore he must be guilty. That has nothing to do with the shooting. Before the shooting, he did some things he should not have done. And as you read along, you're going to see a couple more too. Officer Salamone did not discharge his weapon at the time, therefore there was no use of force. Sanders believed that the BRPD officers appeared to attempt a stop and frisk of Sterling. However, it was performed incorrectly because Officer Salamone covered his partner with his weapon, i.e., the partner was in the light line of sight of Salamone's weapon. So here's the other thing that the guy did. So it wasn't the shooting. It was poor protocol because he could have he used language and pointing his gun at Sterling's head when they had him up against the car was wrong. And then the stop and frisk was performed incorrectly. Apparently, he should have either changed angle to where his partner wasn't in his line of fire, or he should have holstered it and helped his partner, like grab, the guy's other hand. So this is where he failed. It has nothing to do with shooting. Sanders believes the BRPD officer's use of the taser on Sterling was a reasonable use of force. Tasers are used as commonly as chemical sprays, and the use of tasers after failure to follow verbal commands is widely accepted within law enforcement communities. So again, every step of the way, he's comparing their actions to like the standard. Sterling failed to follow the officer's verbal commands. Sterling lifted his body off the hood of the car before he was tased the first time. After Sterling was tased the first time, he went to the ground and was given commands to stay on the ground. Sterling did not follow the commands to stay on the ground. He stood up and was tased a second time. It is not uncommon for a taser to have little or no effect on a person as large as Sterling. Now, this is the part where I thought may have been questionable, but apparently it was good. Sanders thought Officer Salamone's tackle of Sterling was a proper and effective destabilizing technique. The officers had already unsuccessfully tried verbal commands, soft, open hands, and tasing Sterling. Now, as I've said before, there's an escalation of force, and that's they did it properly. Now, the one officer was obviously too extra, pointing the gun at his head and saying, "I'm gonna blow your effing head off." That was out of line. But in terms of the escalation of force, they followed proper protocol. They were in a classic L formation. So one cop was in front, one cop was on the side. Tackling a subject to the ground was a good idea because when an officer has a subject on the ground, he typically just has to hold him to the ground to secure him. While on the ground, Sterling's pectoral muscle was moving, which indicated he was moving or attempting to move his hand. Sanders could not see Sterling's right hand while it was on Sterling's right side, but he assumed. Now, Sanders is the expert, again, not the cops. He's one of the experts. Sanders could not see Sterling's right hand while it was on Sterling's right side. Now, this is when they were on the ground. But he assumed Sterling was moving or attempting to move it based on the pectoral muscle moving. Officer Salamone continued to lose control of Sterling's right hand. It appeared Officer Salamone was trying to hold Sterling's hand down on the ground, and Sterling kept trying to pull it back and away. Although Sanders could not see Sterling's right hand, he appeared to be reaching for something when it went back down. So the expert, the use of force expert, is breaking this down. Sterling's right hand went up while he was on the ground, but then it went back down. The officer believed Sterling had a gun. In Sanders' opinion, under those circumstances, any reasonable officer would have believed he was in a fight for his life. Sterling controlled his own destiny. He could have submitted to the officers at any time and could have ended the confrontation. However, he never submitted to the officers' commands. While on the ground, Sterling's head came up off the ground and he was up on his elbows. He was clearly not complying with the officers and trying to get up. Officer Salamone had control of Sterling's right hand, but then lost it. Sterling could have complied when Salamone had control of his hands, but he continued to resist. Sterling's hand moved down in the direction of his pocket. Sterling's head again came up off the ground, and he was up on his elbows. He was clearly not complying with the officers and trying to get up. Officer Salamone briefly had control of Sterling's right hand, but then lost hand control again. Sterling could have complied when Salamone had control of his hand, but he continued to resist. Sterling's hand moved down in the direction of his pocket. It appeared Officer Salamone attempted to keep Sterling's right hand on the ground when it moved back down in the direction of the pocket, but Sterling appeared to pull it up. Sanders found the fact that Sterling said, "I have a gun, man," after one of the officers said, "I'm going to search his pockets," inconsequential. In fact, it could have been perceived as a threat by the officers. So what they're saying is that the officers told them that when Sterling was on the ground, that he's at least one of them said that they heard him say, "I have a gun." So the guy says that he doesn't find that to have any bearing. And in fact, it could have been perceived as a threat. So again, it all goes back to how things look, because I would have thought that if the guy had told the cops he had a gun, that would be a sign of giving up, or, I guess compliance or whatever. But according to the law, it could have been perceived by a threat. And here we go. This is why I say officers are given leeway to make judgments. They're given leeway to make judgments. And it shows right here. Sanders opined Officer Salamone's use of deadly force regarding the first series of shots was reasonable under the circumstances. The standard is whether a reasonable officer would have believed Sterling was attempting or might attempt to get the gun out of his pocket. An officer does not have to wait until a subject goes for his weapon before acting, because the subject's action will be faster than the officer's reaction. Sanders used the officer's view perspective to evaluate the use of force, not the view or perspective from the camera that captured the video. And this is what I've been trying to tell people as well. It's not determined by what the camera sees. It's determined by how it looks to the cop at the time of this happening. And this says that he don't even have to wait for him to grab the gun if he thinks that he's going to grab the gun. So again, that's why it's important to know what the laws are. That's why it's important to know what the protocol is, instead of just going by what you randomly, think in your head or your opinion. You go by what the law says. He also concluded that the second series of shots were reasonable. Before the second series of shots, the officers could not see what Sterling's right hand was doing, and the threat had not been eliminated because Sterling was still moving. Officers were not trained to shoot to kill. They are trained to eliminate the threat. Sanders agreed with Salamone's statement that Sterling could have shot him or his partner in the femoral artery without removing the gun from his pocket. In addition, gunshots to the femoral artery are almost always fatal. I don't even know where that's at. Femur. Is that your leg? I don't know. But the officers tried verbal, soft hands, taser, and tackling to the ground. A reasonable officer would have thought Sterling had a gun because they were told by dispatch that he had a gun. If Sterling wanted or intended to surrender, he would have raised his hands. Hands above the waist would have meant surrender, and hands below the waist would have been a sign of aggression. Based on Graham versus Connor, Louisiana law statutes, and the Faulkner model, Sanders concluded the use of force by the BRPD officers in the shooting death of Alton Sterling was justified and reasonable. I really like this because it's like not necessarily the verdict. I'm saying they give you a barometer, a standard that you can compare their actions to, not just going by people's opinions. All right, so here's the second expert. Charles Key. Charles J. Key Sr. was the second use of force expert interviewed by the United States Bureau of Investigation, who rendered an opinion. Mr. Key's ability and skills are well documented, and he is recognized by federal authorities as a documented expert in use of force. To summarize, Mr. Key's analysis of the case involving Alton Sterling, Mr. Key also concluded that the force used by officers Lake and Salamone were reasonable. Mr. Key provided the following information concerning his analysis of the materials he reviewed regarding the Sterling shooting to the FBI. Key also used the standard established in Graham versus Connor to analyze the reasonableness of the officer's use of force. Now listen to this. This standard established that an officer's use of force should be evaluated through the perspective of what an objectively reasonable officer would do at the time in the same situation being analyzed. So it's not based off of how it looks from the camera view. It's not based off of, oh, it's just a kid, or oh, it's just a man, or oh, he's just trying to earn money, and it has nothing to do with it. Whether someone's right, whether an officer is justified or not, is based off of if any sane, competent officer was in the same situation, would they have what would they do in the same situation? In his review of the video evidence, Key described the overall tactics he observed by Baton Rouge Police Department officials, Salamone and Lake, during their encounter as poor and somewhat aggravating. This is interesting. However, the tactical problems created by Salamone and Lake were irrelevant when analyzing whether the force used was objectively reasonable under Graham. So he's saying that he personally didn't like how they handled the situation, but under the standard that they use, it fit, like it was passable. The tactical decisions Key suggested the officers could have made were more for putting the officers in a better position to deal with the situation with Sterling. Salamone and Lake responded to a BRPD dispatch, believing that they were responding to a situation involving a potentially violent offender who was armed and who had committed a violent assault by pointing a pistol at someone. Sterling matched the description of this individual with the pistol provided in the dispatch call, which, in his opinion, may have been enough to have established probable cause against Sterling. Throughout the officer's encounter with Sterling, he was actively resistant. While Lake and Salamone's actions created tactical problems which may have escalated the situation as opposed to de-escalating the situation, these tactical problems did not change the fact that Sterling was actively resisting. So I'm going to stop there. So, like, for example, he's acknowledging the fact that pointing your gun at someone's head and saying, I'm going to blow your effing head off, made the situation worse, which is why the guy got fired. It made the situation worse. You're going to make the guy more nervous, and it's just not a good thing to do. It's just not. So that's why the guy got fired. Further, while a subject who jerks his or her arms away from an officer is considered to be actively resisting, any resistance by a subject such as Sterling, who is to believe to be in possession of a firearm, increases in severity from active resistance to assaultive resistance. So, So, because he has a firearm, it's not just active resistance. It's like a whole nother level. While the video footage did not show Sterling reach for his pocket, the footage did not show every angle of the incident. Key assumed the officers did not see Sterling make any overt movements toward his pocket for a firearm when Salamone's firearm was initially pointed at Sterling's head. So it's like, yeah, so like anyone could see, like that cop, he showed up on the scene, pulled out his gun and put it on the guy's head right away. Like, you don't do that. So he didn't, I guess, break the law per se, or maybe he did. But yeah, that was a poor decision. That was a bad thing to do. Police officers are not required to see an actual firearm in order to reasonably believe a subject is reaching for a firearm. The threat posed by a subject such as Sterling, who is believed to be armed, is an imminent threat, which meant the threat is pending as opposed to immediate or instant. Such as Sterling, who is believed to be. Okay. So he didn't have to pull it. So while the police don't have to see a gun for them to pull their gun, um, he didn't have to. While they don't have to wait, he didn't have to do what he did, that cop, by pulling his gun out so quickly. In Key's opinion, instead of initially approaching Sterling up close, the officers would have been at a greater tactical advantage had they engaged Sterling by ordering him at gunpoint from a position of cover. Sterling posed an initial threat to the officers by not complying with their commands to put his hands on the hood of a nearby vehicle. Salamone acted reasonably when he initially drew his firearm because officers may use their firearms to prevent a situation from escalating. Salamone, however, created a tactical problem by drawing his firearm and placing it within approximately an arm's length of Sterling. So this is something I had pointed to before in a video I had made, and I said everyone assumes that because this guy was disciplined, it automatically means more force. You can actually be disciplined for using less force or something like that's kind of a lesser or something that's more endangering to the cop. It's not always automatically too much force. Therefore, that's what the disciplinary action is. So in this case, he did a lot of things wrong. He pointed a gun at the guy, and he was close enough for the guy to grab it. Okay, at this point, when Salamone drew his firearm, Key opined that Salamone should have disengaged from Sterling and given commands to Sterling with his firearm pointed at him based on Sterling's resistance and the officer's belief that he was armed. With respect to the language used by the officers during their encounter with Sterling, Key explained that officers in that situation may need to use whatever language was necessary to convince the subject that the officers may have to shoot the subject. Interesting, because I would have just assumed that was a bit too much. But what he's saying is, because he put the gun to the guy's head and he got so close, that was the problem, not necessarily what the cop said to him. Tactically, the language the officers may have used may have exacerbated the situation more than if they had drawn their firearms and had given Sterling commands from a position of cover. Interesting. Theoretically, it may have been prudent for Officers Salamone and Lake not to announce to Sterling why they were there, because at that point in time, Sterling understood they knew he was armed, and he may have presented a greater threat to them. So the first cop walked over to him, kind of took him by the hands, and kind of was like, hey, stand over here, ladies, go away. And he put himself at danger because he just walked up to a guy that's armed. You just walked up to him. What they should have did was they should have had more care. And that is probably why the other cop was suspended. Prior to the shooting, the officers used less than lethal force by both deploying a laser and by tackling Sterling. While it appeared the taser deployed correctly, the deployment had no effect on Sterling. So again, he's talking about a progression of force. And so one of the checks is, did they just come out there and then shoot the guy? Or did they follow the proper protocol, which is a progression of force? And what they used is a progression of force. Key provided the following additional information and opinion regarding the use of a taser on Sterling. Based on Graham, The use of a taser on Sterling was reasonable. The use of a taser was an acceptable way of dealing with a subject as big as Sterling who had been resisting. The taser was deployed against Sterling in roughly a half-second span of time in manner consistent with the training officers received, teaching them to create distance between themselves and the subject to prevent the officers from being tased themselves. So he deployed it at the proper time. I guess. Tasers are routinely deployed by officers to stop a resistant subject in order to handcuff the subject without any further use of force. So this is important because if people are saying they just shot the guy, they just wanted to kill him, why are they going through these progressions? The taser did not work effectively on Sterling. Had the taser incapacitated Sterling, Key believed the shooting would not have happened. Evaluating the situation from the perspective of the officers, Sterling was not controlled at the point he was tased initially because Sterling got back up after he was tased the first time. In Key's opinion, after the first taser deployment failed, the officers should have backed away from Sterling, taken cover, and talked to him with their guns pointed at him in an attempt to bring him under control. However, even this approach may have only put off the inevitable use of deadly force. So this is interesting. This is interesting. Because, again, you see, in his opinion, you see a tactical error because it's like if this guy's armed, he's resisting, you've tased him, you stay away from him. He's going to be more likely to become violent. So while the one observer said, hey, they did the proper thing, they did a good solution, which was tackling him, the other guy said they should have backed off. Police officers often use de-escalation techniques when dealing with subjects. Even if the officers tried de-escalating the situation with Sterling by speaking with him, the fact remained that no matter what Sterling said or did during his encounter with Salamone and Lake, they believed he was armed with a firearm. While the question Sterling posed to the officers asking him, "What did I do?" could have been an example of him attempting to comply, it could have also been an example of Sterling using subterfuge in an attempt to convince the officers he was not a threat, even though his intentions may have been otherwise. While the video showed Sterling with his hands in the air, a possible sign he was giving up, the officers had just experienced Sterling's continued resistance, even when he was tased and had a firearm pointing at him. Key provided the following opinion and information regarding Salamone attacking Sterling. The dumbest thing Salamone did throughout the entire encounter with Sterling was tackling him. By tackling Sterling, Salamone completely exposed himself and left his partner with nothing but a taser to react. Key identifies the officers subsequently pushing Sterling's head away while he was on the ground as a defensive technique used to try and gain control of his Sterling hands. Key heard someone in the video say, "I got a weapon, man," but could not identify who made the statement. Unless Sterling did something to physically demonstrate he was no longer resisting and was complying to the point of being brought under the officer's control, Key's analysis would not change regardless of what Sterling may have said. So again, he thinks the tackle was a pretty dumb idea, and I remember watching it thinking the same thing. Like, yeah, I don't know. They're just being so close to the person, and he's obviously going to probably try to fight you off because he's probably going to be scared or he's going to be mad. And then you have to be looking out for things that look like he may be reaching for something. That's just going to increase the likelihood of you interpreting anything he does as hostile. So I understand why that was a bad idea. All right. Hopefully we're almost done. All right. Just a few more paragraphs here. Key provided the following information and opinions regarding the shots 4, 5, and 6. Once it is determined lethal force is necessary, officers are taught to shoot to eliminate the threat. The video showed Sterling try to get up after shots 1, 2, and 3. From Sterling's perspective, he may have been moving because he was shot. However, this does not change the analysis from the objectively reasonable officer's perspective. So again, you can only go by what the cop is thinking. Sterling's right hand was not visible. Salamone may have been concentrating on his gun sights at the time shots 5 and 6 were fired. What was seen in the video may not have registered with Officer Salamone. The officer reacted instinctively to Sterling turning in a manner that a reasonable officer would have believed Sterling was reaching for a firearm. So in the video, we see him reaching for the firearm. The cop, he's saying he probably didn't see that from his point of view, but he's giving an explanation on why it was still, those shots were still reasonable. Key provided the following information and opinion regarding the video file identified as V3. Salamone should have never fought Sterling with his firearm drawn and located close to Sterling's hand. The officer should have backed off, covered Sterling, and if he went for a firearm, shot him. Neither officer could likely see Sterling's left hand when he raised it while on his back on the ground. I think he probably means right hand because that's where the gun was at. Additionally, at least from the view of the video, that it looks like his right hand. Additionally, when Sterling raised his right hand while on his back on the ground, it became positioned in close proximity to Salamone's firearm. Wow. While the position of Sterling's right hand in close to proximity to Salamone's firearm did not necessarily mean Sterling was reaching for it for Salamone's firearm, the totality of the circumstances indicated Sterling was a threat. So, interesting. So this guy is saying that Salamone, he basically put him and his partner at risk by continually being so close to Sterling, by engaging him, trying to hold him down or trying to hold him onto the car with his gun drawn, with the guy. So again, it's like, people are like, well, he got fired, so it must have been unjust. Well, him being fired had everything to do with him putting himself at risk and his partner at risk. It has nothing to do with the shooting. Key also opined that while on the ground, Sterling resisted by bunching up his legs and turning his shoulders. If Sterling was completely submissive while on the ground, he would have gone limp. In his final analysis, Key opined that the use of force by the officers was reasonable. Furthermore, he opined that the officers' tactics and training were problematic. If the matters were declined for prosecution, and Salamone and Lake were his officers, he would review the tactical problems with the officers. All right, so I think this is just about it right here. Key provided the following opinions and information regarding the statements Lake and Salamone gave to BRPD homicide detectives. Their statements did not add anything to his analysis. Any inconsistencies in the statements they provided were close enough to the video footage to be explained by an error in the recollection of the officers and or with the officers experiencing possible tunnel vision at the time of the incident. Key found that there were no major deviations between the video footage Key reviewed and the officer's statements. As such, and based on his analysis, Key's opinion is that the officer's use of force was reasonable. All right, so there you have it. You have a great breakdown of two experts in use of force, because they go step by step of the way. They don't miss anything. They don't skip anything, and they give you the standard. Or they give you the standard or the barometer. They looked for an escalation of force, and not just like blunt force right away, like they just came out and just shot the guy. He looked for the proper use of force, the proper use of, I guess, like verbal commands of telling him, like kind of like warnings. They gave him warnings. They used the proper escalation of force, not just ramping up to force right away. And he stated, I don't know. He gave you the baseline case, which is Graham versus Connor. and he explained what the expectations were or what the standard was for each given situation along the way. And the cops did everything right. So in terms of they escalated the situation by being so hands-on with them, but they didn't break the law in doing so. If anything, they just put themselves at risk. They may have agitated the suspect and they put themselves at risk, but it's not a brutality issue. So, I mean, again, just to go back up to the top, or you can see it right there. It's thehayride.com. Scrolling, ain't nothing showing up on the screen. Thehayride.com. And you can read this full report. I'm going to put a link to it. You can read the full report yourself. There's more that I skipped over. And that's my opinion of it. The shooting was justified. There's more to it.